Well, as I mentioned earlier, there is a new president in Iran. Now, Iran's a pretty extreme country. They claim to have an election. It would have been a bit of a phony election, and they have turned up with a new president-elect Ebrahim Raisi, who replaces Rouhani. And Raisi is considered to be even more hardline. Let's have a look at some American commercial television assessments direct from Tehran.
He sure did come out swinging, and it's pretty clear from the get-go that he is an austere, no-nonsense kind of man with little interest in normalizing ties with the U.S. I asked him if all U.S. sanctions, including the Trump-era ones, need to be removed before the JCPOA could work, and that if he would keep the current negotiating team in place. He said that all sanctions have to be removed and verified before the deal can work, but he'll keep the old team in place for now anyway. He quickly dismissed any notion of meeting with President Joe Biden, even if they were to reach a deal on the nuclear program, and absolutely ruled out any notion of a stronger, longer follow-up deal with the U.S. regarding Iran's nuclear program. He said Iran's foreign policy is not going to be limited to the JCPOA, and it won't be negotiations just for the sake of negotiations. But he said he wants to normalize ties with regional rival Saudi Arabia, but that they have to stop interfering in Yemen first.
Ali Arouzi there for NBC in Tehran. Let's go to London now and catch up with former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer. Good to talk to you again, Alexander. I've got to say, one of the most fascinating trips I did with you was to Iran back in about 2005 or so. Firstly, give us your take on the actual election process to come up with a new president. How fair and democratic would it have been?
Well, the regime effectively eliminates a lot of the candidates. They have to be approved by an official council, and the candidates in particular have to have the right sort of religious views, which are the hardline Shia views, which underline the theocracy in Iran. So, I mean, the actual voting may have been fair enough, where we have no way of knowing that, and there's no reason to believe it's not. But the candidates who are allowed to stand have all been prior approved, and in particular and ultimately approved by the supreme leader of Iran, the Ayatollah Khamenei.
Yeah, so it's effectively a theocracy regardless. I want to come back to more about the new president in a moment. But first up, why this is so important even to us in Australia. Firstly, Iran's so crucial to Middle East instability, especially for the way it supports terrorist groups trying to eliminate Israel. And also because its nuclear program has, of course, come under such pressure globally, and we know that US President Joe Biden is looking to reinstate that nuclear deal with Iran. Can you give us your thoughts on where we're headed on those two very big topics?
Well, Iran is incredibly aggressive in pushing its power through the Middle East. It's behind Hamas, it's behind Hezbollah. It supports a range of extremist groups in places like Yemen and so on. So the fact is that it's a very aggressive state, and that is causing huge instability in the region. Now, the Americans want to make a deal under President Biden where the Iranians would agree not to go ahead with building nuclear weapons in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. The trouble with that is that on the one hand, I don't think they're going to build nuclear weapons, and they wouldn't dare. I think it would lead to a huge international reaction. And secondly, there's no doubt about it that the lifting of the sanctions would allow billions to be poured into Iran, which it could then use to support its activities in other parts of the Middle East.
Right, well, just tell us about President-elect Raisi. He's said to be an even more hardliner than Rouhani. What do we know about him, and how much more hardline could the Iranian leadership get?
Yes, well, Rouhani, the outgoing president, is described as a moderate, and at one level he has wanted to negotiate this agreement with the Americans, or not just with the Americans, but with some of the other major powers. The UK, the French, the Russians and so on. The new president is said to be a hardliner, which means that he is even more committed to the fundamentals of the theocratic regime. He's a judge, he's been a prosecutor, and apparently it's alleged as a prosecutor he was responsible for the execution of a large number of people some years ago. When he, who is now 60, Raisi is now 60, when he was in his late 20s, he was a prosecutor even then and putting people to death. So I think this is somebody who would be deeply hostile to the West, deeply hostile to Israel, and deeply hostile to the allies of the West and Israel, which includes countries like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and there's also Saudi Arabia. So I think that he, in the short term, will be a force for great instability. And his election just underlines the virtue of President Trump's policy, which had been to have, if you like, an intolerant approach, maximum pressure it was called, towards Iran, and not sit down and try to negotiate some fruitless nuclear deal which would put billions and billions of dollars into the pockets of the regime.
Yeah, worrying stuff. Thanks for sharing your insight, Alexander. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Chris.
Alexander Downer there, live from London, giving us some insight into that change of leadership in Iran and why it matters to us here in Australia, this really tough-minded theocracy that interferes in the affairs of the Middle East, the affairs of other countries, and of course is very anti-West, has an even more hardline leader. We'll keep an eye on that for you.